Yes, would you ask Dr. Barker to come back, please? Okay. All right, ready to carry on?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Bennett.
Dr. Barker, thank you for coming back to us. I just want to ask a follow-up question, if I can. You said this morning, in the course of examination, that when you signed off Ms. Cooney's report as fine, there were areas you needed more information on. If there were areas on which more information was needed, why didn't you raise those areas with Ms. Cooney as part of your review?
There wasn't time, really, until the report was due to be sent out. So I considered it, well, I don't actually remember whether I did raise anything with Kate. I can't remember. However, we thought it was better to send the report out, and then the design team had an understanding of the things that needed to be clarified, and then they could be discussed at a later date.
Had you had more time, would you have raised those areas with Miss Cooney as part of your review and got to the bottom of them before the report was sent out?
Yes, I think we would have tried to obtain more information and get to the bottom of it, yes.
So was this something of a missed opportunity, do you think?
With hindsight, yes.
Thank you. Can we go back to where we were then when we broke at the lunch break, which was looking at the draft report itself? Can I ask you to look at it? It's at TMO 1000, 1925, page 15. And I'd like you to look with me, please, at paragraph 7.1. And this is under the heading Requirement B5, Access and Facilities for the Fire Service. You see that?
Yes.
And under 7.1, Provision of Fire Mains, and it says that the height of the building means that a firefighting shaft is required for the residential floors, and one is provided, as stated in the current fire risk assessment. There should be a dry rising main within the firefighting shaft, and the outlets from fire mains should be sited within the firefighting stair. The main is located in the lobby approach. This is an existing condition. Now, you say there, or she says there, as stated in the current fire risk assessment. When you did your review, did you notice the reference in here to the current fire risk assessment?
Yes.
You did. Did you read it? Did you read the current fire risk assessment?
I did read the fire risk assessment, yes.
You did. It's quite a long document, so, but you got that into your 2 hours, did you?
Yes, I did read it.
Right. Now, it's at, we don't need to look at it necessarily, but we've looked at the fire risk assessment and we can't see anywhere where it mentions that Grenfell Tower was provided with a firefighting shaft. Now, I don't know whether that's something you've had a chance to consider yourself, but on the footing that I'm right about that, can you explain why Ms. Cooney thought, under your review, that the current fire risk assessment did say that a firefighting shaft was provided for the residential floors in this building?
I think it's probably a reference to the 2-hour fire resistance around the stair and the ventilation provided at
Right.
the head of the stair.
Well, let me ask you it a different way. Did you yourself verify whether or not the fire risk assessment did say that there was a firefighting shaft?
I don't remember.
Right. Did you verify any of the assumptions or statements made by Mr. Stokes in his fire risk assessment? I haven't shown it to you because I'm assuming you're familiar with it, but if you're not, I can show it to you. But as a general
I don't
question.
remember.
Right. If you don't remember, well, let me ask it this way. If you hadn't verified the assumptions in his fire risk assessment, how would you satisfy yourself that Ms. Cooney's draft report was accurate?
I don't know.
Well, let me be slightly clearer in my question. How would you satisfy yourself that Ms. Cooney's report about the assumptions and statements made by him was accurate?
I would have gone to the fire risk assessment
Right.
to look at it.
Do you know or remember whether James Lee attempted to identify a firefighting shaft on his site visit?
I'm not aware that he did. I'm only aware that he took some photographs.
Do you recall thinking that the TMO should be advised that they should confirm whether there was or wasn't a firefighting shaft for the residential floors?
No.
Why not?
Because when the building was designed, it wouldn't necessarily have had to have a firefighting shaft. That was my understanding. It had to have 2 hours fire resistance, and it needed the rising main.
Ms.
From
Cooney
memory.
says at 7.1 that the height of the building means, she says it, that a firefighting shaft is required for the residential floors.
It
Was
did
she
on the
right about
current-
that, or was she wrong about that?
Yes, under the current guidance.
Yes, and given that that is correct, why didn't you verify whether by looking at the FRA or Mr. Lee's work, whether one was provided?
I did look at the fire risk assessment and I thought it stated that there was a firefighting shaft in there.
How long did you spend actually looking at the fire risk assessment, Dr. Barker?
I don't remember.
We're going to come back to it in due course this afternoon. Let me just move on. Could you go back, please, to page 5 of the same document? And we looked at this earlier under section 1, introduction. And in the third paragraph, it says, well, I suppose fourth paragraph, it is expected. It says, it is expected and therefore assumed that the existing building has been built to the prevailing standards of the day, thought originally to be the building regulations 1965, which did little more than require the structure of the building to have fire resistance. The design of the building predates the guidance of the 1971 Code of Practice, CP3. The London Building Act Amendments Act 1939, however, required features to be included in the building which are very comparable with today's standards in terms of firefighter access. The date of later developments is unknown. Now, we looked earlier at London Building Act amendments being relevant. This is a specific reference to them here. Were you familiar with Section 20 of the London Building Act Amendment Act 1939 at the time?
Yes, I had seen the act.
You have.
Yes.
You had seen the Act. Were you familiar with Section 20?
Yes.
So you were familiar with the fact that it required buildings of more than 100 feet, that's 30 metres, or buildings over 80 feet if the area of the building exceeds 10,000 square feet, 25 metres high if that area exceeds 930 square metres. You were familiar with that, were you?
Yes.
Did you know at the time how tall Grenfell Tower was?
No, but I could have made an assumption based on the number of stories or looked on the sections to see
Right.
how high it was.
Well, did you make an assumption?
I can't remember.
Right. Did you know at the time that Grenfell Tower was 67.3 metres tall? That's 220 feet and 10 inches.
Okay.
Did you know that?
Yes, I think I would have known that.
You would have known that. So would you have known, therefore, that Section 20 of the London Building Act Amendment Act 1939 applied to this building?
Yes.
And did you know what the relevant design codes were relating to the statutory requirements under Section 20?
It was provisions for the fire service, access to the building.
Right. And where were those contained? What code had those in them?
That's in B5 of approved document B.
Right. Now, given that according to the scope of work we looked at earlier, and we can look at it again if you like, the design of the building was to be assessed against the relevant design codes relating to the statutory requirements on design of the building under Section 20 of the LBA 1939. My question is, did you think at the time that it was sufficient for Miss Cooney to assume and expect, as she says here in this fourth paragraph under the introduction, assume and expect that the building was built to the prevailing standards of the day?
Yes.
Why was it sufficient for her to assume and expect that?
Well, I wouldn't have thought it would have been allowed to be built if it didn't meet those standards of the day.
Did it occur to you to question that assumption and expectation?
Not at the time, no.
So, well, why is that?
Well, as I said, I wouldn't have thought that the building would have been built had it not had the relevant approvals under the guidance at the time.
And what about later developments? Was it sufficient for Miss Cooney to assume and expect that the building was developed later in accordance with prevailing standards of those later days?
Yes, I would have assumed that it had been done if any further developments had taken place.
Was it not part of Exova's job in providing a complete existing fire safety strategy to examine the correctness or otherwise of these assumptions and expectations?
Not necessarily, because we were just looking at the design of the building and comparing it to what the current standards would be initially.
If you were preparing an existing fire safety strategy for an existing building in circumstances where one had never been done before in the full 40 years of its existence, just under 40 years of its existence, would you not think to check the building to make sure that, as a starting point, the building was compliant with relevant building standards so far as they related to fire safety?
Yes.
So why didn't you?
I don't know.
Can we then turn to, I'm so sorry, back to the scope of work on page 2. The scope of work, which I should have given you a reference to, I'm so sorry, it's very good. I didn't even have to give the reference, and the document manager has produced it. Thank you very much. Now, on page 2 here, under proposed scope of work, it says the proposed, or the scope of the work for the project, this is the second paragraph, would therefore include a site visit. You see that? Mm-hmm. Expected to take no longer than half a day to survey the building's architecture and fire safety systems. You see that?
Yes.
Before James Lee left Exova, did you have a conversation with him in which you asked him for his notes on the site survey, or did this all happen after he left?
No, I didn't have a conversation with James because my involvement with Grenfell only began after he'd left.
So at the point you took over responsibility, which was after he left, as I think we established this morning, did you know, well, let me ask you, did you think that a site survey would be required?
Yes.
When would that be carried out?
I don't know, because I think after that I then found out that he had been to site. Are you meaning somebody from the Warrington office to do a site survey?
Well, let's look at it this way. You get the proposed scope of work within the fee proposal around about the 24th of July. And then you go to a meeting on the 26th of July. And you can see from the document that part of the scope of the work would include a site visit. Did it occur to you at the time that a site visit was going to be needed in order for the report to be produced?
Yes.
Right. And when was that site visit to take place?
No, I don't mean that I was going to do a site visit. I mean that I saw a copy of the fee proposal,
Yeah.
and saw that a site visit was required, and I think I found out that one had already taken place.
Are you referring to the site visit that James Lee did at the end of May?
Yeah.
Did you know that he'd done it at the end of May?
I didn't know the precise date of it. I just knew that he'd carried out a site visit before he left.
I see. Did you know that he'd done it prior to the fee proposal even being drafted by him?
No, I didn't know that.
Did you ask yourself why, if he'd already done a site visit, he would be providing for a site visit to be conducted?
No, I didn't ask myself that.
Did you make any investigations at all when you took this project over on the 24th of July to find out whether the site visit referred to in the fee proposal had already been done or whether it remained outstanding?
No, I didn't take any steps to find that out. I just assumed that the site visit that he'd carried out was in relation to the existing building fire strategy.
Did you ask yourself why the site visit that he had carried out was the one referred to in the fee proposal, given that the fee proposal post-dated it by some weeks?
No, I didn't.
Given that you didn't have, as you've told us earlier, a note of his site visit or a report or any conversation with him before he left about a site visit, can you explain why you didn't commission or perform yourself another site visit in order to be able to produce at least a draft existing fire safety strategy?
We looked at the photographs that he'd taken, but to be honest, I didn't have the time to do a site visit.
Right, thank you. Did you or Miss Cooney discuss together whether the draft that she had produced would be improved by a site visit?
No.
Did you at any stage tell Mr. Soames or the TMO that in order to finish this document off and produce a final version, a site visit was going to be needed?
No.
Why is that?
I don't know.
The scope of work also says, halfway down page 2, that, and it is just about halfway down page 2, it says, in developing the report, we would use our expert knowledge of fire safety design codes. The report for the building will consider the following items. And then it says means of escape and fire safety systems. Just focusing on fire safety systems, Dr. Barker, do you know or did you ask what investigations Mr. Lee had carried out in order to assess the fire safety systems?
No, but I couldn't because he left.
Correct. So does that tell us that an investigation into the assessment of the fire safety systems in the building was yet to be done?
There were fire safety systems mentioned in the fire risk assessment.
So this was a paper exercise based on Carl Stokes' 2010 report?
Yes, in some respects, yes.
I see. So how would you know whether the fire safety systems were the same or in the same condition in August 2012 as they had been reviewed by Mr. Stokes in December 2010?
I wouldn't know. I would just take
that,
the information from the fire risk assessment.
That's 18 months during which things about fire safety systems in the building could have changed, at least in terms of their maintenance, which was unchecked. Was that satisfactory?
Usually the fire risk assessment is updated periodically, or it's updated if there are significant changes within the building. So
Yeah.
we assumed that the current fire risk assessment stood.
Was that a safe assumption to make, given that it was not, by August 2012, a particularly recent document?
I don't know, possibly.
Do you know, or did you ask, what investigations Miss Cooney had carried out into the existing fire safety systems at Grenfell Tower?
I think I discussed it with her, however, she had used the fire risk assessment.
Did you see anything in the report by way of an analysis of the fire safety systems?
Not really an analysis. The report states what is there in the common areas and makes an assumption on what's provided in the flats themselves.
Indeed. Let's look, if we can, together at Carl Stokes' fire risk assessment of the 29th of December 2010, please. It's at TMO 100377743. And if we can just look at the very first page of that document together, you can see areas not covered. You see that?
Yes.
At the bottom of the page. Dr. Barker, are you all right?
Yes, sorry, I'm just blowing my nose.
Okay. Areas not covered.
Yes.
And it says all the private residential apartments, the ground floor electrical substation, Dale Youth Boxing Club, Grenfell Nursery, the access to the upper ground floor level, and the upper ground floor level offices complete. When you reviewed Ms. Cooney's draft, did you notice, or did you know, that these areas had not been covered by the FRA?
Yes.
Does that tell us that, so far as Miss Cooney's work is concerned, she hadn't reviewed those areas either?
She did look at them in terms of the means of escape.
Right.
I believe, yes.
Okay, we'll come to the means of escape later. Did you discuss with Miss Cooney why there was, or whether there was, any further fire risk assessment for the areas not covered by Mr. Stokes's review?
No, I didn't.
Why is that?
I think because we were primarily concerned with the risk assessment for the residential parts, and because of the fire resistance provided between the residential parts and these areas, we considered them almost to be separate entities.
So, does that, maybe I misunderstood that answer you've just given us, but are you saying that because you were primarily concerned with the risk assessment for the residential parts, there wasn't actually, therefore, a fire risk assessment which Mr. Stokes had done, which was relevant because private residential apartments had been excluded?
Yes, private residential apartments wouldn't normally form part of a residential building risk assessment. The risk assessment stops at the flat entrance door.
Yeah. How would you be able to assess and analyse the existing fire safety measures by way of checking Ms. Cooney's work, given what's not covered expressly by Mr. Stokes in this fire risk assessment?
In what way do you mean the private apartments or the other common or communal areas?
Well, let me ask it a slightly different way. Did you approach Ms. Cooney's draft on the basis that it was limited to the same parts of the building that Mr. Stokes's FRA was limited?
Yes.
Yes.
I suppose, yes, I did.
And that would that mean that those areas would mean, wouldn't it, that those areas not covered by Mr. Stokes's analysis would also not be the subject of your existing fire safety strategy at all?
No, they were covered in the strategy.
They were covered in the strategy, but without reference to the FRA. Is that right?
Yes.
So what information did you have for those other parts of the building not covered by the FRA
The floor plans.
if they hadn't done a site visit?
So it's the floor plans.
It's the floor plans. Right, thank you. Can we now turn, please, to a document, TMO 100 37740. This is an email from Paul Dunkerton to Miss Cooney of the 13th of August 2012, attaching Mr. Stokes's FRA, which she had asked for. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, it didn't include what Mr. Stokes called the significant findings and action plan that he had also prepared on the 29th of December. Now, you were not copied in on this, but do you have a recollection of such a document existing?
No.
Well, let me just go back then, if I can, just to jog your memory. If we can look back at the fire risk assessment, TMO 100377743, page 1 again. At the foot of that page, you can see just underneath the areas not covered, there's a rubric. The significant findings and action plan of this fire risk assessment are inserted next with this document, continuing at page 2. So when you did see this report, as part of your review of Miss Cooney's work, did you notice did you notice that you didn't have the significant findings and action plan of the FRA?
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
No.
Can you explain why you didn't?
No.
Well, it's a slightly negative question to ask. Let me try it a different way. Would significant findings and an action plan of a fire risk assessment, highlighted like this in bold on the first page, not be an important extra document or rider document for you to examine so that you could understand the full advice being given by Mr. Stokes as part of his fire risk assessment?
Yes. However, I would also have thought that there would have been mention of the findings actually within the risk assessment itself before they were summarised in a separate document with an action plan.
At any rate, you told us you didn't notice that you hadn't got it. Can we take it that there was therefore no discussion between you and Miss Cooney about whether you should have it and why you didn't have it?
Yes, there was no discussion.
Yeah, right. can I then go back to the scope of the works in the fee proposal, TMO 1003771 at page 2? This is about the fourth time, I'm afraid, Dr. Barker, and I apologise. I've taken you back to this. It's the scope of the works again. We looked at this morning. In the first paragraph there, the second sentence, this report will serve to inform the fire safety risk assessment and fire risk management plan for the building. You see the reference to the word fire risk management plan there, you see. How did you expect the report would form a fire risk management plan for the building if neither you nor Ms. Cooney had undertaken a detailed review and analysis of the existing fire risk assessments and also the documents accompanying it, such as the significant action plan?
Well, again, the report was primarily to look at the design of the building in relation to compliance with approved document B. So if there were areas of non-compliance or measures that were in place, that serves to inform the fire safety risk assessment and the management plan of the building.
Yes. And how would the report serve to inform the fire risk assessment and the management plan of the building, the next one that was to be produced, if you didn't have the whole of the last one?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why, when it was sent out as a draft, there were areas that needed to be looked at, that needed more information.
Dr. Barker, you didn't notice, as you've told us, that the FRA that Ms. Cooney had been sent by the TMO did not include the significant findings and action plan. So how could it have been something on the radar to be looked at next if you hadn't noticed it?
I don't know.
Is the reality that you didn't have time to chase up this extra document and make sure that you fully understood the full extent of the FRA because you were going on holiday?
I think time was a factor. It wasn't necessarily because I was going on holiday. There was other workload factors there. I
understand that. And if you'd had different workload factors, lower workload factors and more time, would you have asked Ms. Cooney to get hold of the full significant action plan, having noticed that it was missing, and incorporated that into the report, even though a draft, so that you could make the best shot you could at informing the fire safety risk assessment and fire risk management plan as instructed?
Yes, probably would, yes.
Can I ask you to look back, please, at the fire risk assessment. At the draft report. Just in general, and this might speed things up a little bit. And this is at TMO 1925, but this might speed things up. Do you recall that there are many unknowns and assumptions throughout the draft?
Yes.
I mean, I could list them all, and I could spend time doing that. But you accept that they're there?
Yes.
Was it usual that an existing fire safety strategy, even in a draft, would have so many uncertainties in it, so many assumptions and uncertainties in it?
Yes.
And you say yes. What normally would then happen to those assumptions and uncertainties?
I think if it was a strategy for an existing building that was just done as a piece of work and there was going to be no refurbishment done on the building, it would be a slightly different scenario, because you would want to gain as much information as you can about that building so that you can complete the report. But because the refurbishment was being carried out sort of concurrently, or the design for the refurbishment was happening concurrently with this report for the existing building, it was understood that we'd potentially be able to get more information as time went on and Terry attended meetings. That's the way that I understood it.
I see. Well, let's look at just one or two together if we can, because there are too many to go through each of them this afternoon. Can I ask you, please, to look at the draft report TMO 1925, page 8, at 3.2.1. This is under means of warning, levels 1 and 2. And she says in the draft, it is unknown whether the community areas and nursery are covered by an automatic fire detection system, AFD, or a manual system triggered by manual call points. You see that?
Yes.
And then she says in the next paragraph under the same numbered paragraph, there is detection within the ground floor lift lobby. The provision of this detector would only serve to inform the management of the building of a fire and presumably disable the operation of the lifts. Note the word presumably there. Did you think to check with Ms. Cooney the basis on which she made the assumption that the detection system would disable the operation of the lifts?
That's usual practice for when a detector detects smoke, is that the lifts aren't to be used in the event of a fire and they return to ground.
So
That's general passenger lifts. Firefighters' lifts, where there is one, are different because they tend to have a control mechanism that can be used by the fire service when they arrive.
given that there'd been no site visit and no test of the lifts to see whether in fact this detector did actually disable the operation of the lifts, why was that assumption made?
Because that's common practice in designs, and I think also what she's meaning with that sentence is that when that detector activates, it might not necessarily sound an audible alarm and warn the people in the flats.
Why did you think that it was safe to approve a draft report that contained an assumption which had not been checked, merely because it was an assumption based on common practice?
Yes, but this could have been something that could have been discussed later on as well with the design team as they read and digested the draft report.
I see. Are you aware of any way in which this report or any later communication flagged up in crystal clear terms, both to Studio E and critically to the client, that all these presumptions had to be double-checked to make sure they were valid?
No, I'm not aware.
Why is that?
I don't know.
She says in the first sentence, it is unknown whether the community areas and nursery are covered by an AFD or a manual system triggered by manual call points. Why was it unknown? Why was that not something that had been checked before the 15th of August?
I don't know. I'm not sure whether when James went to site, whether he was given access to those areas. And we didn't have the fire risk assessment for those different areas.
Let's look at another one, 3.3.6, page 10, please. Under 3.3.6, in the third line, it says, the distance to the stairs from the flat entrance doors appears to be more than 7.5 metres from the flats with entrance doors to the north of the lift shaft, the maximum of which is approximately 8.3 metres, scaled from microfiche plans to be checked on site. This excessive distance of less than 1 metre results in an increase of travel of less than 1 second and would be considered to be acceptable under current standards and risk assessment. Now, did you not want to know why Ms. Cooney was content to proceed on the basis of appearances and not precise measurements?
Well, as she says in there, it's been scaled from microfiche plans. Yeah. So it may well have been less than 8.3.
Yes. My question is, were you happy, or why were you happy that she was going to proceed as she has on the basis of appearances? In other words, working off plans and scaling up from them, as opposed to on-site precise measurements?
Again, there wasn't sufficient time
Time.
to go to site.
So time. Okay. Under section 3.4, same page, smoke ventilation. She says, and this is at 3.4, on the following page, which is page 11, please. The third paragraph down. She says there, in the third line, it is understood that fans are positioned. Do you see that?
Yes.
It is understood that the fans are positioned at the base of the shaft. It is unknown how the fresh air ventilation shaft operates in a fire condition, the rate of extraction the system currently achieves both naturally and mechanically. It is also not known how the existing system performs as a natural shaft for the purposes of escape prior to fire service intervention. Again, Dr. Barker, same question. Did you not want to know why Ms. Cooney was content to proceed on the basis of what she didn't know?
Well, she's put in the report that what is provided is unsatisfactory, and she's noted that it's going to be changed, and that was the information that we'd been given, that as part of the refurbishment works, the ventilation system would be upgraded.
I see. Okay. So these were things to be tested rather than unknowns that could be solved by her, by way of a site visit. Is that right?
No, they probably, or they may have been solved by a site visit.
Are you familiar with PAS 911/2007, a document
I've seen it, yes.
you have, which bears the elegant title, Fire Strategies, Guidance and Framework for Their Formulation? You are. Can we have a look at that, please? It's BSI 6066, please. And I'd like to turn to page 46 within it, which is internal page 46, so page 52 of the document on our system. BSI 6066, page 52, in turn. Now, this is paragraph 9.2 I'd like to look at with you, please. Where it says level of detail. Do you see that?
Yes.
At 9.2 it says, the strategy is designed, and I should just put this in wider context so everybody can understand this, finalizing the fire strategy document. And under 9.2 level of detail, it says, the strategy is designed to be a single overview of all relevant fire precautions specific to the building. It is not meant to specify detailed designs or arrangements, but is there to give sufficient guidance for more detailed assessments and designs. In this way, it is likely to continue to be relevant throughout minor changes to the building, its occupants, etc. However, it should also not be so vague as to lead to ambiguous or misleading conclusions. And then if you look at paragraph 7.1.3 on page 37, if you go back a little in the document, there's a photograph of some people having what we used to call a meeting. And at paragraph 7.1.3, it says under first review, collation and review of information received with relevant stakeholders. Where the information is found insufficient or ambiguous, further investigations may be required. This may include, for instance, the requirement for system health checks. This will involve one or more meetings with stakeholders. Now, given that is a... Well, let me ask you this. Was PAS 911, which we've just been looking at, a guiding framework for you in your work when you were reviewing Miss Cooney's? No? Why is that? Can you explain?
We just didn't use it. It's not mandatory to use it, so we didn't use the PAS 911 framework.
Right. Are the principles that I've just shown you on those 2 pages principles that, nonetheless, you and your practice when reviewing a draft would adopt?
Yes, there are some common practices in there that
Right.
in the way that we did our projects.
Why were you content to sign this report or draft report off as fine when there were so many unknowns and so many matters which had been assumed where the assumptions had not been verified?
Because it was sent out on the basis that it was a draft, on the understanding that these issues could be clarified
Yes.
in the future.
My question is, even though it was sent out as a draft, why were you happy to sign off on it as a fine draft, notwithstanding so many unknowns and so many unverified assumptions?
Because I was happy that that was a document that could be built on at a later stage to provide more information.
Right.
And be a complete document.
I see. Can I just then go back to the draft report at page 10? That's TMO 1925 at page 10, and look at paragraph 3.4 with you, please. Smoke ventilation. We looked at the start of this paragraph, but then went over the page. I just want to come back to the beginning of it. Halfway down that first paragraph, 4 lines down, it says, the dimensions of the shafts are unknown. Do you see that?
Yes.
The dimensions of the shafts are unknown. From the microfiche archive drawings, they appear to be in the region of 400 millimetres by 600 millimetres each between their internal walls. These measurements are not able to be precisely scaled and should be checked on site. The shafts appear to continue up to the roof of the plant housing where they are terminated. The details of the shaft termination cowls / protrusions are unknown. You see that?
Yes.
Did you not want to know why Ms. Cooney was content to proceed on the basis of appearances in respect of those shafts and not precise measurements?
I think in the timescale that we had for the report and the quality of the drawings shown on the microfiche, I think it was reasonable of her to say that they were in the region of those dimensions and they needed to be checked on site because she was making the point that what is provided doesn't comply with the current guidance. So yes, it did need to be checked on site.
And when would that happen, did you think?
Possibly at some point after the draft report had been issued and the design team had seen it and discussed it with my colleague Terry.
Given the numbers of assumptions which had been unverified and the numbers of occasions when Kate Cooney had identified things as unknown, can you explain why you didn't, instead of signing off her report as fine, amend it to identify, or suggest that she amends it, to identify in a list or shopping list of some kind, future investigative actions to determine or confirm unknown or assumed facts?
I don't know why I didn't. And with hindsight, I probably should.
And the same question, why didn't you make it absolutely crystal clear to the TMO and Studio E that until and unless the missing information was obtained and the assumptions were verified, the draft couldn't be relied on?
Again, I don't know. And with hindsight, I probably should.
Did you consider how, unless those matters were verified and the unknowns were made known, the TMO, as the responsible person under the regulatory reform order, could discharge their obligations under it?
No, because I assumed that some discussion would be held regarding the draft report to try and rectify or clarify some of the assumptions that were made in the report.
I see. Can I ask you to go back to the report itself, on in the report, I'm so sorry, back in the report to page 7. We're on page 10. If we can go back to page 7, I want you to look with me, please, at section 2, purpose groups. Now, there are 3 of them, per the guidance in approved document B: residential, assembly, and offices. You see that?
Yes.
I just want to look at residential. But did you consider whether it was important that the report should reflect or examine the characteristics of the occupants under each of these purpose groups?
No, because the purpose groups in approved document B in a way reflect that in themselves. In themselves, for example, when it's residential, the risk is that there is a sleeping risk. So you have to consider then the means of warning may be different to what's required. For example, in an office purpose group where people are familiar with the building, it's their place of work and they're generally awake.
Yes. Was any consideration given to how the characteristics of the occupants as individuals would impact, or rather would need to be addressed by the TMO as the responsible person when managing fire safety in the building?
No.
I mean, for example, did you give any consideration or ask why Ms. Cooney had not given any consideration to, for example, people who may need assistance in escaping in the event of a fire because they had mobility problems?
Well, for residential buildings in approved document B, there is no requirement to consider occupants that have mobility impairments. For residential buildings, it is not a requirement to have disabled refuges because of the remaining place evacuation policy. So you rely on self-evacuation, so the occupant of a fire-affected flat, they're the only ones that receive a warning that there's a fire in their flat, so they can evacuate. The person who lives next door doesn't receive a warning that something is going wrong in the flat next door, and the provisions are in place so that there is a sufficient level of fire resistance around each apartment that other people should not need to evacuate. And with a residential building, there is not always a management presence on site. So with a disabled refuge, an EVC, a voice communication system, is required, and it's a safe area for somebody with a disability to remain until they are rescued. But if there's no management presence there to consider that, then it will fall down at that that plan will fall down. So in the other parts, the offices and assembly, if there are any stairs to negotiate, in those areas, there would generally be a requirement for a disabled refuge.
Did you have any thoughts at the time about how the TMO would comply with its obligations under the RRO in relation to its fire safety management plan? Without having some kind of guidance or strategy for assisting people who need assistance from evacuating the building, whether they're from their own flats, which are on fire, or whether by way of a wider, more generalised evacuation?
Possibly, but when you're considering the guidance in the ADB, it is assumed that people can self-evacuate from their flat.
Yes. What about, is that, as a fire engineer, experienced fire engineer, was it your experience and understanding that that assumption was also made in the obligations under the RRO?
I think under the RRO, they would need to consider their residents and consider if some of them did have mobility impairments, to house them in a high-rise residential building might not be an appropriate place to put them.
Let me see if I can put the question a bit less delicately, a bit more bluntly. Did it occur to you, when you saw Miss Cooney's report, to think to yourself, Gord, given that we're dealing with residents in a high-rise block, and we've got to advise the TMO on the fire safety management plan for the occupants, we should look at how we're going to get people with mobility issues out?
No, I didn't consider that.
Can you help us understand why that is?
Because again, if they did have mobility issues, then maybe Grenfell Tower wasn't the best place for them to live. To reiterate, approved document B does not make any provisions in residential buildings for people with mobility impairments.
I see.
That's not to say that they can't be put in, but the ADB does not make provision for them.
Now, can I then move on to another area of this report?
Mr. Millard, I've got one eye on the clock.
Yes.
At some point, I imagine we're going to need to take another break.
Yeah.
Quite happy to leave it in your hands.
Yes.
It doesn't want to be too much later.
No, that's right. Well, let me just do one more topic, and then we'll move, if that's all right.
Yes, that's all right.
Dr. Barker, is that all right with you? You feeling all right to go on for 10 minutes or so?
Yes, okay, 10 minutes.
Well,
I don't want to-
don't be pushed into it by Mr. Millard. Do you feel you need a break now?
Yes, I would like one.
Yes, I
please.
think that's sensible.
Is this another case for a quarter of an hour?
I'd rather 10 minutes if it were possible. The last time we took quarter of an hour, nothing very much happened. Apart from me having a... Yeah, no. So if we say 10 minutes, I think...
We'll take 10 minutes. If you need longer, you better let me know.
Very good. Is 10 minutes all right for you, Dr. Barker?
Dr. Barker, we'll have a 10-minute break now, please. Go with the usher. Please don't talk to anyone about your evidence.
Okay.
All right? Thank you. 3:10, please. Yes, would you ask Dr. Barker to come back, please?
Which page? 14.
All right, Dr. Barker?
Yes, thank
Now, if at any stage you feel you'd like a bit of respite, just indicate, will you?
Okay, yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.
Yes, Mr. Phillip.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Dr. Barker, can I just examine ADB with you, just in light of the answers you were giving us earlier on in answer to my questions about mobility difficulties? Can I ask you, please, to be shown CLG 0000173 at page 14? And if you look at the rubric inclusive design under paragraph 019, you see that? There is reference here to the health and safety of all persons, including people with disabilities. You see that?
Yes.
And it goes on, part M of the regulations, that's the building regulations, access to and use of buildings requires reasonable provision for access by people to buildings. Regardless of compliance with building regulations, there will also be obligations under the Disability Discrimination Act 1995 for service providers and employers to consider barriers created by physical features in buildings. People, regardless of disability, age, or gender, should be able to gain access to buildings and use their facilities both as visitors and as people who live or work in them. As such, the fire safety measures incorporated into a building will need to take account of the needs of all those persons who may have access to the building. It is not appropriate, except in exceptional circumstances, to presume that certain groups of people will be excluded from a building because of its use. And then over the top of the next column, the provisions set out in this approved document are considered to be a reasonable standard for most buildings. However, there may be some people whose specific needs are not addressed in some situations. In some situations, additional measures may be needed to accommodate these needs. These should be done on a case-by-case basis. Can I also then show you page 18 under paragraph B1 little 5? Page 18, B1 little 5. Criteria for means of escape. And if you look at the note under that, it says some people, for example, those who use wheelchairs, may not be able to use stairways without assistance. For them, evacuation involving the use of refuges or on escape routes and either assistance down or up stairways or the use of suitable lifts will be necessary. Now, I've shown you that again to refresh your memory. Looking at that again, it's not right to say, is it, that ADB was completely devoid of any guidance in respect of people with mobility issues?
No, I didn't say that it was completely devoid. And the guidance with respect to flats, the provision of disabled refuges is not mentioned in that section, and disabled refuges aren't generally provided in flats because the emergency voice communication system that would go with it would need to communicate with somebody, albeit a management presence. In many high-rise residential buildings that are built, there can be no management presence. So if there was a person within the refuge, there wouldn't be anybody there to rescue them. Similarly, evacuation lifts could be provided, but they aren't. They're not mentioned in the section of guidance on means of escape from flats.
I note those answers, and that's very helpful in a more general sense. Coming back to your specific role in signing off as fine Miss Cooney's draft, and given that your understanding was that she was working from approved document B as the design code, can you explain why, even though she identified the residents as a purpose group, there's nothing in the report about whether about the suitability of the building in respect of fire safety for those with mobility issues?
Yes, that's right. There is no provision in there.
Yeah, and why is that something you didn't pick up when reviewing her draft?
I did. It's not that I didn't pick up on it. It's that within residential buildings, we wouldn't normally require there to be provisions in place for mobility impaired persons.
Yeah, and coming back to the question I asked just before the break, given that that in ADB there is at the very least a consciousness that fire safety systems should take account of people with mobility issues, can you explain why the draft that Ms. Cooney produced and you signed off on did not advise the TMO that when formulating their fire safety management plan, consideration should be given to a strategy which incorporated or included keeping disabled people safe?
Sorry, could you rephrase the question?
Yeah, I can rephrase it, yes. Can you explain when you signed off Ms. Cooney's draft why there was no advice given to the TMO in it about how their fire safety strategy was going to keep people with mobility issues safe in the event of an evacuation?
No, I can't explain.
Okay. Sticking with the subject of evacuation, can I take you to page 8 of the existing fire safety strategy, please? TMO 1000-1925, page 10. And I'd like to look, please, with you at paragraph 3.3.4. Uh, 3.3.4, evacuation principles, residential. The recommendations in the current guidance of approved document B support an evacuation strategy which is based on the following assumptions, it says. And then you can see the 4 of them set out. You see that?
Yes.
And you told us earlier that the evacuation strategy that you understood that was in place at Grenfell was stay put.
Yes.
And you refer to that as an evacuation strategy.
Yes, an evacuation policy. Strategy,
policy.
Yes.
Does stay put as a strategy rely on a high degree of compartmentation?
Yes.
Look at paragraph 3.3.4 in the third bullet point. It says, due to an assumed high degree of compartmentation and therefore a low probability of fire spread beyond the dwelling of fire origin, simultaneous evacuation of the building is unlikely to be considered necessary. See that?
Yes.
Did you understand the basis on which Ms. Cooney had made that assumption?
Yes. That is also an assumption in approved document B because of the level of fire resistance to the floor, the floors within the building and the walls between adjacent flats and between the flat and the common lobby on each level.
Well, you say it's an assumption in approved document B. Rather than debating that with you, let me ask you a question. Did you ask Miss Cooney what information she had relied on to assume that within Grenfell Tower there was a high degree of compartmentation?
No, but I took that to mean that the provision of concrete floors, a concrete frame and masonry walls would provide the compartmentation.
Did you note when you examined this report as part of your peer review that no investigation had been done of the fabric or the build-up of the compartment walls?
No, however, the fire risk assessment does refer to the walls being masonry and the floors being concrete.
Yeah.
I do remember reading that in the fire risk assessment.
And did you note that Ms. Cooney hadn't recommended that an investigation into the fabric or the build-up of the compartment walls should be carried out?
No, I didn't know that.
No.
Can I ask, did the drawings you were provided with tell you what the materials of the building were?
No, they
Yeah.
general arrangement layouts don't tell you what the building fabric is.
Given that the stay put policy or strategy relied on a high degree of compartmentation, can I ask you why you didn't suggest to Ms. Cooney that she should include some guidance or some advice that further inspection of the layout, the materials and the build-up of the compartment walls was necessary in order to verify this assumption?
I understood that that could be a matter for discussion following the receipt of the draft report by the design team. And also it would involve going into a resident's flat, which at the time I understood we didn't have access to the actual dwellings themselves.
And as you say, in fact, the dwellings themselves were outside the scope even of the fire risk assessment
They
done
are
by Mr.
outside.
Stokes that you were relying on.
Yes.
So if Mr. Stokes hadn't done an assessment and you hadn't done an assessment, what was the assumption of the high degree of compartmentation actually based on?
When the building was originally constructed, it was required to be a 2-hour concrete frame. So that will be the basis of the fire resistance of the floors. Each floor will be a 2-hour floor.
Right. So this is similar to an answer you gave this morning. You just presumed compliance at the point of origin
Yes.
without ever checking it.
Yes.
And similarly, the statement in the same part of the report, simultaneous evacuation of the building is unlikely to be considered necessary. Did you analyse or ask Miss Cooney if she had analysed whether the stay-in-place or stay-put evacuation strategy was the most appropriate one for this building?
No, I didn't specifically discuss it with her. However, it is usual practice for residential flats to operate a remain in place policy, and the stairs are sized accordingly, as opposed to a building which has a simultaneous evacuation strategy where you have to consider all of the people in the building trying to get out at once, and the stairs would have to be the appropriate width.
Yeah. Can I just ask you to turn on then, please, in this report to page 13 and look at paragraph 5.1.3. Fire stopping within concealed spaces. You see that?
Yes.
And she quotes from approved document B, the building shall be designed and constructed so that the unseen spread of fire and smoke within concealed spaces in its structure and fabric is inhibited. And then she says there are limits to the extent to which any cavities can exist, for example, between walls and cladding and between ceilings and roofs. Fire stopping via appropriate cavity barriers are assumed to be in place. These elements are not usually visible without invasive surveying, and it is recommended that these elements are assessed within void flats to a level which would provide confidence in whether or not the provision is satisfactory. Can I take it, Dr. Barker, that you understood the difference between a fire stop and a cavity barrier?
Yes, I understand the difference.
Do you think that it was clear, or did Miss Cooney mean cavity barriers here where she said fire stopped?
I think she means both. There is a diagram in approved document B, diagram 33, I think,
There is.
which shows where compartment floors meet the external walls. You need a fire stop and a cavity barrier. Otherwise, you need cavity barriers around openings, whereas fire stopping is there to ensure the integrity of fire separating elements at junctions or where there are openings through them.
Yes, well, we could spend time debating the definition. My question is, what you didn't, I think, suggest that she should amend the existing fire strategy to make it clear that she was referring to cavity barriers.
No, I didn't.
Why is that?
I don't know.
Was it because you had too little time, perhaps?
Possibly, yes.
Now, in this section, she says, as I've shown you, there are limits to the extent to which any cavities can exist, for example, between walls and cladding and between ceilings and roofs. Did you understand what she meant there?
Yes, again, referring to the diagram that's in approved document B.
Yeah.
You have cavity barriers around openings, such as windows.
Yeah.
And then you also have a cavity barrier between a wall and a cladding, so that you, usually at every floor level, to prevent there from being, it allows there to be a cavity, but it prevents the cavity from being too big so that fire can spread unseen within that void.
And again, why didn't you suggest Ms Cooney amend the draft to make that clear?
I don't know.
Okay. Now, the paragraph, as we've seen, continues. She says, these elements are not usually visible without invasive surveying. You've seen that. I showed it to you. Did you find out from Kate Cooney, or from anybody, whether there had been any attempt to investigate or inspect the compartmentation of the building physically?
No.
No.
Don't know.
Was it not vital, in order to understand the efficacy of the compartmentation in this building, to consider the fire stopping of services or the existence of adequate cavity barriers?
Yes. I assumed, though, that the cavity barriers would be looked at while the window replacement work was undertaken, as that would be an area where you've got openings where cavity barriers would be required.
But that's looking forward. We're looking at the existing fire strategy report that you were approving. Was it not vital, in order even to produce a sound existing fire safety strategy, that you should understand the efficacy of the compartmentation in the building?
Yes.
And you took no steps other than to look at the drawings in order to do that?
Yes.
I think as we discussed earlier, and just let me ask it again, it's right, I think, isn't it, that a stay-put evacuation policy relied on a high degree of compartmentation and a low probability of fire spread beyond the flat of origin?
Yes.
Yes. Did you think that it was necessary to make clear that any defects in compartmentation would affect the stay-put strategy or affect its efficacy?
Not at the time. With hindsight, yes, it should have done.
And again, can you explain why you didn't make that clear, or ask Ms Cooney to make that clear when you did your review?
I don't know.
Again, lack of time, is it, perhaps?
Yes,
Workload?
possibly. Lack of time.
In your statement, and there's no need to turn it up, but it's paragraph 3.13, you say that you reviewed your report alongside the drawings, and you told us earlier this morning that you did do that, you confirmed it. What assistance did the drawings give you in reviewing Ms Cooney's work?
It gave me the general layout of the floors, so I could see the layout of the apartments, where the stair was located, the layout of the lower floors. Sections would have given me the height of the building.
Right. Okay. Well, let's just move on to the question of the height of the building. Can we go back to something we looked at this morning in the report, or perhaps just after lunch, at page 15, paragraph 7.1, under provision of fire mains. We looked at that this morning, or earlier, and it says there should be a dry rising main within the firefighting shaft, and the outlets from fire mains should be sited within the firefighting stair. You see that?
Yes.
And now if we looked at 7.3, firefighting shafts, it says in the fourth line down, let's look at it together, the fire risk assessment describes the provision of a firefighting shaft and firefighting stroke evacuation lifts with a dry rising main. Current guidance would be for a wet rising main, as the building is over 50 metres in height. The provision of a wet main saves time in firefighting operations due to the increased time for a dry main to be primed by the pumping appliance. The time delay in priming the dry riser is not considered to have an adverse effect on firefighting operations due to the high levels of compartmentation and fire resistance of the building elements of structure. As you say, it says current guidance would be for a wet rising main, as the building is over 50 metres in height. Can you explain why she says that there should be a wet rising main in paragraph 7.3, but there should be a dry rising main in paragraph 7.1?
No, I can't explain it.
Did you notice?
Mr. Bennett, is that right? She says in 7.1 there should be a dry rising main,
Yes,
second line. And then the wet rising main is
7.3.
referred to in 7.3.
Yes.
Well, I think you had it the other way around.
You understand the point I and the chairman, I think, are putting to you. In 7.1, you refer to a dry rising main, 7.3 to a wet rising main, or she does. My question is, did you notice that contradiction when you reviewed the existing fire safety strategy?
I didn't, and I should have picked up on that, because a wet rising main would be required as the building's over 50 metres.
Right. So you accept that that's something you should have picked up in your
Yes.
review?
However, the fire risk assessment states that it's a dry rising main provided.
Yeah. Now, Kate Cooney describes the purpose of the existing fire safety strategy to provide a baseline for the proposed refurbishment works. Did you understand that that was their purpose, or its purpose?
Yes.
What did you understand by baseline in that context?
We were looking at what approved document B would require now and outlining what was provided within the building, with the view that in the future, when the refurbishment works took place, any building work resulted in it being no worse than it was before.
Yeah. So, okay, I'll come back to that in a moment then. Can I then just go back to something we were discussing a moment ago, and that's the relationship between stay put and compartmentation. Can I ask you to look, please, first of all, at the report at paragraph 3.3.4 on page 10. We looked at this a minute ago, where you said, or say, in the second, or she says in the second bullet point, there is no reliance on rescue for evacuation other than via the main core. You see that? Mm-hmm. Can you now also then be shown paragraph 3.2.5 on page 8? Which says in the last line there, evacuation of flats beyond the dwelling of fire origin would be carried out under the control of the attending fire service if necessary. When you reviewed this report, did you see that there might be a possible contradiction or conflict between those two statements?
No. I don't believe there is a conflict.
Well, in one, it says that evacuation of the dwelling beyond the dwelling of fire origin would be carried out under the control of the attending fire service. And in the other, it says that no reliance would be placed on rescue. How would you, or did you try to reconcile those two statements to make them fit together? It's a factual question. Did you do that?
No.
You didn't. Do you accept, sitting here now, that those two statements do require to be reconciled?
No, because I take that to mean that there is an alarm in each flat, and the alarm in the fire-affected flat will warn the people of that flat. They will evacuate on their own, and it is accepted that in the process of them escaping, some smoke may enter the common lobby, and that's why there is a ventilation system in the common lobby. Now, if somebody else on that floor came out of their flat, they may feel the need to evacuate. They won't have been warned, but the ventilation of the common lobby is supposed to maintain tenable conditions for them to escape. If then the fire brigade arrive on scene and find that conditions within that lobby are not tenable, they may then start to evacuate the remaining flats on that floor. That's what it means.
I see. So going back then to paragraph 3.3.5, which we looked at a moment ago. Sorry, 3.3.4, if we can, a moment ago, on page 10, 3.3.4, there is no reliance on rescue for evacuation other than via the main core. What does that mean?
It means generally that occupants will self-evacuate. If the fire service deem it necessary to evacuate the other flats on a level where there is a fire in a flat, I take that to mean that they will knock on their doors and ask them or tell them that they would be it would be a good idea to leave.
Is that what you mean by rescue? Or is that what you understand by the word she used? I
yes.
see, right. Now, you refer to a minute ago, you referred to the smoke ventilation system. Can we just look at that briefly? You, I think, attended the project meeting, as you told us before, on the 26th of July, and we looked at the minutes of that. We can go to it again, but I can take this more quickly. I think at that meeting you requested a copy of the specification of the smoke extraction system for Grenfell Tower. And that was sent to you on the 31st of July 2012. And you refer to that in your witness statement, paragraph 3.9. And you say it was needed in order to prepare the existing fire safety strategy. I've summarised quite a lot there, but do you accept that?
Yes.
Thank you. You say in your statement that the reason is that in residential buildings there are requirements in relation to travel distances in the common corridor from an individual flat to the stair and for the corridor to be ventilated.
Yes.
Yes. Did you know what the travel distances were at Grenfell Tower?
When I received the ventilation document, no.
So,
Would have got the travel distances from the drawings when we were sent the drawings.
Right. And was that an important aspect of the report that you were reviewing?
Yes, and Kate alludes to that in the report about the 7.5 metre single erection limit that's recommended in approved document B for a single stair.
Yeah. If you go to page 10, which I think we're on still at this document 3.4, under smoke ventilation, she refers to assumptions made from information available. You see that?
Yes.
Assume that the common area to each residential floor is ventilated, etc. And she says in the fourth line, the dimensions of the shaft are unknown, and we looked at that, and the measurements should be checked on site. And in the fifth paragraph of this section, which I think you need to go over the page for, she says the existing system is unsatisfactory. You see that?
Yes.
And then she goes on to say, and it's covered by the word draft, but it's just about halfway down that paragraph within the big A in draft. This also casts into doubt the justification on grounds of escape time, the excessive travel distance as outlined in 3.3.6 above. As the ventilation provision is critical to the stay-in-place evacuation principle, it's strongly recommended that the performance of the automatic system of mechanical ventilation as existing and as proposed is assessed in order to ensure that a satisfactory level of safety is provided to the residents throughout the tower. You see that?
Yes.
Did you? Finally, I should just show you 3.3.6 on page 10, because go back to page 10. 3.3.6, she says under common areas, in the third line, the distance to the stairs from the flat entrance doors appears to be more than 7.5 metres from the flats, with entrance doors to the north of the lift shaft, the maximum of which is approximately 8.3 metres, scaled from microfiche plans to be checked on site. And we looked at this before. The successive distance of less than 1 metre results in an increase of travel of less than 1 second and would be considered to be acceptable under current standards and risk assessments. Now, we looked at this before. My question is, did you notice that Ms. Cooney had not actually stated the basis of her assumptions here?
In what way?
She's
not stated the basis of her assumptions.
No.
Do you mean as relating to the requirements of approved document B?
No, in relation to the measurements.
Could you rephrase the question, please?
Well, she says in that paragraph at 3.6 that the distance from the flat entrance doors appears to be more than 7.5 metres from the flats, with entrance doors to the north of the lift shaft. And she then goes on to say that it should be checked on site. Mm-hmm. Did you, when you did your review, notice that Ms. Cooney hadn't stated the basis of that assumption?
No.
Did you notice during your review that the whole fire safety strategy...
I'm sorry, Mr. Millett, it may be my fault, but I thought she was telling us here that it's more than 7.5 because it appears to be 8.3 scaled from the plans.
Yes.
Well, that's the basis of her... What assumption are you putting to the witness?
I'm putting the assumption that it remained an assumption based on the plans and hadn't been checked by reference to physical measurements.
No, it hadn't been checked on site at that point.
No. And that leads on to a series of questions. Did you notice during your review that the whole of the fire safety strategy was reliant on a smoke ventilation system working properly in order to maintain tenable conditions for means of escape purposes?
Yes.
Yes. And did that to you mean that the lobby smoke control system had to be in full working order? Because if it wasn't, then the travel distance would not be acceptable.
I think what Kate was seeking to do in the strategy is to say that it would be acceptable to have a natural ventilation strategy if the shaft was big enough. But in section 3.4, she goes on to state that from the drawings, the shaft is not big enough for a natural ventilation strategy. So the only way that it would be acceptable would then be to provide a mechanical system. If say, the shaft had been big enough for a natural ventilation, then it may have been acceptable for the travel distance to be 80 centimetres greater than the recommended distance. However, because the shaft isn't big enough, Kate is trying to convey that that ventilation system may not work satisfactorily, therefore a mechanical one should be provided.
Yes. I mean, cutting to the chase on this particular point, Dr. Barker, did it not concern you at the time that here was a building which had excessive travel distances, mitigated only by a smoke extract system which worked, and if it didn't work, there'd be a problem?
Yes.
Is that not something that, well, let me try it slightly more neutrally. Did you think at the time to amend the report so that that problem was made crystal clear to the TMO as the recipient of this draft?
No, I didn't.
And again, why?
Again, with hindsight, I should have done.
Right. Now, you've explained what the baseline purpose of this document was. Can I perhaps see if you can agree with what Mr. Vetch says? Can I take you back to his statement that we looked at right at the start of your evidence this morning? It's MET 000065130. And he produced this statement for the police in August 2017. Page 2, please. And I'm looking at the third paragraph on that page. And he says there in the fourth line, we completed a fire strategy for the existing building prior to regeneration works. As there was no fire strategy in place, this was required as a base from which to work from for the purpose of completing a fire strategy for the building during the works. And then he says also in on the next page, on page 3, in the second paragraph, if you see that, he says, our strategy for the existing building therefore then became the baseline from which the refurbishment would be done. And that's also important, as during construction they need to understand what the fire strategy is for the building during the refurbishment and as it is being constructed. First of all, do you agree with Mr. Vetch's description of the purpose of the existing fire safety strategy for Grenfell Tower that I've just read out to you from his statement?
Yes.
You do. What role did Mr. Vetch play, do you remember, in the production of the existing fire safety strategy, or indeed the outline fire safety strategy?
He didn't provide any role.
Right.
No.
When you read Miss Cooney's draft existing fire safety strategy, did you spot the fact that she didn't anywhere in the report link the existing building or the draft existing building fire safety strategy report that she'd done to the fire safety needs of the primary refurbishment works?
No, I didn't.
Did it occur to you to suggest that she should amend the report to make that link so that whoever picked up the existing fire safety strategy, even if in draft, would understand what it was for?
No, because I understood that following the discussions with the design team after they'd received the draft, once we had a clearer picture of some of the things that needed to be clarified, we could then update the report and make that correlation.
Does it come to this, that in order to be effective as a proper and reliable baseline, as Ms. Cooney and Mr. Vetch and you have described, the existing fire safety strategy needed to be finalised, all the elements of assumption and lack of knowledge or information filled in, completed, so that it was a finalised document?
Yes.
And that as a draft, it could never fulfil that purpose?
Yes, it needed to be updated.
Right. As Principal Fire Engineer reviewing the draft existing building fire safety report and as senior to Ms. Cooney, Dr. Barker, given the omissions and the assumptions and the lack of and the gaps in it, can you explain, sitting here today, why you described the report that she'd done without any further elaboration as fine?
No, I can't. I can offer a possible explanation, which was I sent the email back to say it's fine, it's possible that had I printed out the report and marked up things on the drawing, on the report, that there were things to put in it. I do not remember. However, I considered that it was acceptable to be sent out as a draft on the understanding that there were a number of issues that needed to be discussed and clarified before the proper issue of the report could be done.
And in your supervisory role as peer reviewer, senior to Ms. Cooney, do you accept that it was your responsibility to point all those matters out to the reader of this draft and ensure that they were addressed by the next person picking it up?
Not necessarily in that draft. I think it was important for me to communicate with Terry, who was going to be taking over the project, the items that needed clarification.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barker. Now, Mr. Chairman, I've come to the end of the questions thus far this
Yes.
afternoon. It's customary to take a short break in order to make sure that with my team, covered
Yes.
absolutely everything.
Yes.
And
Have you any idea how long you might need for that purpose?
I think if we say 10 minutes or so for the moment, if we need a little bit longer because there are questions coming from outside this building, then we'll let you know. It's
Right, well,
important,
if I
as you know,
say
Mr. Chairman, it's
5
important that those people who are watching this remotely have an adequate opportunity
Of
to.
course, they must. If I say 4:05 in the first instance, would
That-
that be all right?
in the first instance, that would be very good, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Barker, those are the questions that Mr. Millett wanted to ask you, but he needs time just to check that there aren't other matters that need to be put to you. So, as you've heard, we're going to have a short break until probably 4:05. Could be a bit longer. We'll see how we go.
Okay.
So, would you please go with the usher now and don't talk to anyone about your evidence?
Okay.
All right? Thank you very much. Right, 4:05 then. Good. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Dr. Barker to come back, please? Right. Thank you, Dr. Barker. Well, it may be that Mr. Millett has some more questions. I haven't actually asked him yet. We'll see. Yes, Mr. Millett.
I do have a few questions, Dr. Barker, but they shouldn't take too long, Mr. Chairman. First, in your experience, were the agreed fees for this job, by which I mean the production of the existing fire safety strategy as per the 11th of June fee proposal, unusually high or unusually low, or usual, considering the time that would be required to do a proper job?
With hindsight, and if the project had been run completely from London, I still think they were a little bit on the low side.
Can you give us an idea of how much on the low side, do you think?
I would have envisaged it being possibly 50% higher.
I see. Do you know, or did you know, why they were set a little bit on the low side, as you say?
No, I don't know. It could possibly be due to the fact that as James prepared the fee proposal, he was intending to carry out the work himself, so he allowed for the amount of time that he would spend on it based on his charge rate.
I see. Oh, I see. Do you know why he left?
I don't.
You don't. Have you previously worked on an existing fire safety strategy for a private or luxury project? And not necessarily the same thing. But
Off the top of my head, I can't remember if I have worked for a private or luxury project, but I have done existing building fire strategies.
Well, let me ask it differently. Would Exova's proposed fees, so hourly rate, numbers of hours allocated to the task, be the same regardless of whether the project was a luxury development in a high-end part of town or a simple private development or social housing?
No, I don't think they would. I don't think we would charge a premium rate because we were working on more expensive apartments.
Now, are you aware of Kate Cooney's email which described making a crap building worse or crap condition worse?
Yes.
Which we looked at when she gave evidence.
Yes.
Given that, did you see this job essentially to be a paper exercise whose aim was to pass building control rather than as an actual strategy to ensure that lives were saved in the building?
No, I don't think it was just a paper exercise. I think Kate's email, rather bluntly, was referring to one particular aspect of the design which didn't comply with approved document B and needed addressing.
Now, we looked earlier in the afternoon at your evidence about the compartmentation and the need for an investigation into the build-up of the compartment walls. At the time of this report, August 2012, were you aware of compartment fires or fires on the exterior of buildings in the UK or elsewhere?
Yes, there'd been the fire at Lacanau House.
Yes.
A few years before.
In 2009?
Yes.
Now, at this stage, of course, you may or may not remember, the coroner had not yet delivered her report, and I don't think the inquest hearings had yet happened. But to what extent was the Lacanau experience in your mind when reviewing Miss Cooney's draft for this building?
I don't actually think I considered it.
So does that tell us that the fact that it was a high-rise residential building not raise a particular flag about the risk of fires?
No.
No. What experience did you yourself have of refurbishment like this, involving a substantial change to the exterior of a relatively old building?
I can't remember. I don't actually think I'd worked on a project that was a refurbishment of that scale before.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Barker. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions. This panel member, no further questions. Dr. Barker, thank you very much indeed for coming here and assisting us with our investigations. We're extremely grateful to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I'd echo that, Dr. Barker. Thank you very much for coming. It's a bit of a journey, and I'm glad we've got your evidence finished this afternoon. So back to Warrington this evening?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Good. Well, that's not so rushed. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. You're free to go.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Millett. Well, that's it for the day then.
It is, Mr. Chairman, yes. And
Nearly finished in time.
almost. I'm getting better. Miss Grange will be here in my place tomorrow, and I shall be in hers. And we have the next witness,
Yes.
Mr. Ashton.
Good. Thank you very much. And that'll be 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you. 10 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you.